Fristo, and I'll be your moderator. Today, Sensible Financial's founder, Rick Miller, and senior financial advisor, Laura Williams, will be speaking about older adult living options. Rick Miller holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and started Sensible Financial 20 years ago this April. He is also a certified financial planner. Laura Williams has a degree in finance from Bentley University and holds both the Certified Financial Planner and the Chartered Special Needs Consultant designations. She's been with Sensible Financial for nearly 8 years. This is the fourth and final webinar in Sensible Financial series on older adult living. The first 3 webinars, Housing Issues for Older Adults and Potential Solutions, Long-Term Care and Long-Term Care Insurance, and Housing Options, are all available for viewing on Sensible Financial's website at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. Today's webinar will address CCRCs, Continuing Care Retirement Communities, with an emphasis on their financial implications. In next month's webinar, Rick will discuss the recent investment performance of bonds. You can register for upcoming webinars through a link in the Sensible Financial April newsletter, which will be published later this month, or at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. There will be 2 Q&A sessions during this presentation, one approximately midway through the webinar and one at the end. Please submit your questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your window. Rick and Laura will answer as many questions as they have time for. Unfortunately, they can't give personal advice in this setting. There just isn't time to gather the proper information and context. But we will offer contact information for Rick and Laura at the conclusion of the webinar, so you can contact them personally for personal questions. Now, Rick will begin by highlighting conclusions from the series.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. Older adult living options is a very broad subject. And even though we're presenting 4 webinars, and this is the final one, we're just scratching the surface. Laura and I hope that you will take away 3 main ideas from the 4 webinars, including this one. First, while each person's and each family's experience will be different, those experiences will likely fall within a somewhat predictable range. That broad predictability offers people and their families an opportunity to plan for a relatively small number of general contingencies. Then, when specific situations arise, people and families will be better prepared to respond effectively and to achieve outcomes that they're happier with. Second, the path of least resistance when people need help is for family members to provide it. This can have a lot of advantages, but there are significant costs too. Providing that kind of care is a big responsibility, and it can be exhausting with long-term consequences for the caregiver. Managing that commitment can help families maintain their own health and well-being and prevent the caring commitment from taking over the entirety of their lives. Finally, and for Laura and me as financial planners, a major point, long-term care is not 100% an additional cost to be dealt with if the need arises. Every financial plan can adapt to supply some resources to apply to long-term care. Many expenses will be lower than planned if someone needs long-term care. And now, let's move on to discussing CCRCs, Continuing Care Retirement Communities. We'll start by looking at this broad spectrum of older adult living options, and we've looked at it in each of the previous webinars, and we see down here at the bottom CCRCs. And just to position this in context, it's helpful to think about, first of all, the different kinds of settings in which one can receive care, starting out being at home and living independently, needing some support, needing more support, needing lots of support. And then we think about the delivery model from do-it-yourself, which means living at home and bringing in support and bringing in care, all the way down to hiring it out completely, and CCRCs are in that category. And CCRCs both represent transferring or responsibility and control for decisions about care to someone else, but also getting a lot of help with those decisions. And CCRCs are special and relative to all the other options in that they incorporate or bring together the entire range of care needs. So they are, in effect, a complete solution. I want to emphasize that today the examples we're providing are meant to be illustrative, and each person's situation and the facilities that you're considering will impact the analysis and the conclusions that we might come to. So let's talk just a little bit more about the options that a CCRC incorporates. And you see down at the bottom here CCRC, but the CCRC incorporates all three of the independent options that we've considered before. So independent living, assisted living, and a nursing facility, usually all on the same campus, all under the same management. And you can see that there's a great deal of difference between the independent living, which is the most, the one where people have the most independence and the most freedom to make choices about what they're going to do and when they're going to do it, all the way up to situations where people need a great deal of help, which is the nursing facility. And you see that the nursing facility offers lots of help and nursing care. And the living arrangements are quite different from independent living to nursing facilities, and usually CCRCs have multiple buildings or multiple facilities on their campus to offer those various living arrangements and the various degrees of help. And now we're going to have Laura talk to us about Sally Sample, who is going to be our example person today.
All right, so today we'll be reviewing Sally's Samples plan. So Sally is 82 years old. She is single and she is wealthy. So she has significant home equity as well as retirement assets and non-retirement assets. In addition to those assets, she has regular income from her pension and her Social Security. When we ran Sally's financial plan, we determined that Sally has sufficient resources to support her living standard over her lifetime, now through age 100, if she chose to remain at home and if she needed no care. So under those assumptions, we've told Sally she could afford to spend $70,000 on just consumption expenses every year now through age 100. Sally has told us that she only spends about $37,000 on consumption expenses each year. So there's a large gap between what she could afford to spend and what she's currently spending. And some of those assets could be used to fund potential care costs. Here we're taking a look at Sally's lifetime balance sheet. And this is how we determine how much Sally can afford to spend. We add up all of her lifetime assets. So that includes all of her savings, her future income, including her Social Security benefits, and her pension. We subtract from that everything that we've said is committed spending in her plan, all the future taxes she's going to owe, expenses to keep her home over time, and any special and insurance expenses. The difference between that pool of lifetime assets and lifetime committed spending is what Sally could choose to spend on consumption over time. So in Sally's case, this is about a pool of 1.3 million. Given that Sally is spending much less than she can afford to, a portion of those assets are what we call a surplus. She doesn't need those assets in order to fund her current living standard. Additionally, we don't assume that Sally sells her house at any point in this financial plan. So that would be an additional resource that Sally could tap if she needed to in the future.
Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit more about continuing care retirement communities. As we said at the outset, they offer the full range of living arrangements, independent living, assisted living, and nursing care, all in one location. And they're designed to make transitions easy from one to the next. And that's a major benefit. In effect, the decisions about where to move if you need more care are already made. And decisions about when to move are made by or heavily supported by the CCRC. If you have to make these decisions alone, they can be very burdensome and emotionally draining. Because if for example, you needed to move from independent living to assisted living, that's a hard decision to make. It may feel that that you're giving up a lot, and at the same time that you're facing the fact that you may need more help, you're also, if you're, let's say, living at home, having to decide where you're going to move. So that's a lot of stress at a very difficult time, and hard decisions at a very difficult time. And if you're in a continuing care retirement community, that decision is much easier to make. And the CCRC has a great deal of experience to help you with that decision. CCRC contracts are also comprehensive. They cover housing, activities, nutrition, and care. CCRC contracts differ in how the costs of changes in care level are managed. And we're going to speak more about that very shortly. People tend to move into CCRCs a decade or more after they retire, and CCRCs can be selective in who they admit, and we're going to see right now why that is. When one contracts with a CCRC, there are broadly 4 different ways that you can do that. And it's, in some cases, with some CCRCs, it's possible to choose among contract types. With others, they offer only one. Each of the contract covers housing, residential services, and other amenities, but they differ a great deal in how they price, and we're going to see what that means in a moment for some of the benefits that are associated with them. So we're going to look at 4 contract types: rental, type C, type B, and type A. And we're going to look at the components of those contracts: entry fees, fees for independent living, and fees for assisted living and skilled nursing. And the general idea with a CCRC is that you move into independent living, and if you need more help, then you move to assisted living or to nursing care. So the rental contract is very much like, if you will, an apartment with access to services, but you can come and go almost as you wish. The contracts are month to month. There's no or very small entry fee. Monthly fees for independent living are lower than they are in other kinds of contracts. And if you need help, assisted living and skilled nursing, you're going to pay the full market rate for that. And like an apartment, you don't have any ownership interest in your unit. And all the services are a la carte. With a type C contract, there is an entry fee, there is some ownership interest, but the monthly fees are low, and again, the services are mostly a la carte. When we move to type B, the entry fees tend to be higher, the monthly fees for independent living tend to be higher, and if you need help, or if you need nursing care, there is something of a subsidy. You're not going to pay the full increment in cost that might be associated with those in a rental contract or a type C contract, or let's say if you were living at home and you needed help and you were having help brought in. The type A contract typically has the highest entry fee and the highest independent living fee. And very importantly, the monthly fees do not increase if care is needed. And there's a sense in which that is very much like long-term care insurance. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And it's like long-term care insurance, but it's not like long-term care insurance in that you can't use the promise, if you will, that the type A contract CCRC makes anyplace else. So it's institution specific, if you will. So and what we've said here is that as you move from left to right, we're getting more long-term care insurance, and I should have long-term care insurance in quotes because it's available only at the institution or applicable only at the institution. And why do we say that there's long-term care insurance? The reason is that the fees do not change at a Type C contract. With a Type C contract, the fees do not change from the situation where there is no care, and therefore there would be low cost of care, to a situation where you might need nursing care, high cost of care. And you could think of the difference between the fees and the costs when the fees are higher than the cost as premiums, and the benefits and the costs, or the costs of the extra benefits and the fees as benefits in situations where you need a lot of help. And why do we say that's insurance? We say that's insurance because insurance is moving resources from times when times that are really good to times that are more expensive. And that's in effect what's happening here. We're moving resources from situations when times are economically good, costs are low, to times when costs are high. We're kind of moving resources here this way, and we're keeping the fees flat or the same. Now, that means that CCRCs with offering Type A contracts are offering a kind of insurance, but they're not regulated the way insurance companies are. And that, I think, I believe, poses something of a problem. Providing insurance like this is a complex financial challenge, and it requires that you forecast the amount and cost of care that residents are going to require. It requires setting fees so that you can manage this transition here. And it requires that you update the fees based on experience, and you have to manage the finances associated with the premiums and the benefits. So if you are going to, as a consumer, assess the CCRC's financial health, that means you'd need data that of the kind that an insurance company would have on I say claims experience. It's data on how much care their population needs and when they need it. And so if you were going to assess their financial health, you'd have to have that information. And data usually the CCRCs don't gather or aren't willing to share. And you'd also need an actuary to help you evaluate it. And because most of us are not, and I'm certainly not an actuary, but an actuary is a professional that insurance companies hire to help them match premiums and benefits. Okay, finally, with entry fees. Entry fees are like purchase prices, but they don't confer ownership rights. So thus you could think of them more as a deposit than as a purchase. Usually only part of the entry fee is refundable, and the refundable part of the fee would be part of the resident's estate if the resident dies before moving out. The entry fee also serves as an extra asset that can be used to cover the monthly fee if the resident exhausts other assets. And I say maybe, and the contract would specify if that's possible. And finally, the refundable portion may decline over time. Some CCRCs do that, some don't. So that when you're, I guess, if we go back to thinking about the contracts for a moment, the major point here is that CCRCs are very different. You can't just say, I'm thinking about moving to a CCRC. It's important to understand what kind of CCRC you're moving to and the benefits that are associated with the kind of contract that they offer. Okay, Carrie, I think this is a good place to take a few questions.
Okay, and we have a few. Okay, Michael asks, relative to your spectrum of senior living options, how do you categorize memory units?
A memory unit would be in the nursing care end of the spectrum.
Okay. Larry asked, could you please give examples of typical requirements during for entry
Typical requirements for entry
into
Uh,
CCRCs?
into
Yes.
CCRCs. Yes. Laura, would you like to talk about that?
Sure, I have a couple we could talk about, and if you want to add, feel free. A lot of them may want to be sure that you can live independently. So there may be some questions or tests pertaining to being able to live independently when you first move into a CCRC. Financially, they'll take a look at all of your assets and income and determine whether you have sufficient resources to keep up with the fees over time. They don't want to be in a situation where you're depleting your assets prematurely.
Right. And I think those are the two categories of requirements that are most salient. And just to expand a little bit on what Laura said, the reason that the CCRC is interested in your health, especially if it's a type B or type A contract, is that they are providing insurance and they're promising that they'll provide any care you need at that fixed monthly fee. And they can't survive if everyone they admit needs nursing care right away. Their economics just won't work. So in effect, they're medically underwriting the residents or the applicants who want to live there. And then from a financial perspective, as Laura said, they want to be sure that the applicant can keep up with the fees and that that a problem for the CCRC would be if someone who is healthy, the particular problem would be if someone who is healthy can't keep up with the fees because they're counting on the healthy part of the population to cover the costs for the part of the population that's not healthy. So they're testing financially to see if people can stay with them for the rest of their lives.
Here's another question. One of the benefits of CCRCs would be the bundling of services, but one of the disadvantages is delegating those choices to the institutions. Are there any alternative means of bundling services that gives the consumer more control?
I'm not aware of alternatives. I think that the best alternative that gives the consumer the most control is to, in effect, do it a la carte, if you will. And I suppose it would be possible to design your own path. Let's go back here a little bit. Okay, so you could say, well, I'm going to stay at home for a while, and then I might want to move to an independent living facility, and I'd pick one, and then I'd pick an assisted living facility, and then I'd pick a nursing facility if I need one. And I would plan to move in that sequence. I think we don't see a lot of people who do that. I think it's pretty demanding from a sort of the management perspective. I guess we don't see people do that consciously. We do see people who, let's say, stay at home and then they must move to assisted living or they must move to a nursing facility. And if they're fortunate, they may have, or planful, they may have identified one before the need arises. But picking out the whole sequence, I think, would be pretty complex to manage.
Okay, there are many more questions, but here's another. This person's wondering, people are often concerned that a CCRC would make decisions about how much care they need, and the people would lose control of that decision. They're concerned that the CCRC would perhaps force might be a strong word, but force them to have more care than they need because it would benefit them financially. benefit the CCRC financially. Is that a reasonable concern?
With a type A contract, that's probably not right. I mean, the financial incentives are not for the CCRC on a type A contract to move people to a higher care situation when they don't need it, because the CCRC would be incurring more cost and not getting more revenue. So that would be exactly the wrong thing for them to do. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay.
Now, I think there might be more of a concern about that in the let's say with a type C contract, where everything is priced at a market rate, but it's not obvious to me on the face of it that would be in the CCRC's interest. They shouldn't, unless the care services are way overpriced, and it shouldn't be that shouldn't be their incentive. And of course, there are reputational issues for them to deal with then too, because a lot of people move to CCRCs or other older adult options because their friends are there. And if people have a bad experience, then they're not going to refer their friends.
There's another question that a couple of people are asking. Are there any tax benefits related to the fees, or are any of the fees deductible?
I'll speak to that one a little bit. It varies. A lot of the answers you're going to hear today is it's going to vary based on which specific community that you're talking to. So if you have specific communities that you're interested in, I would suggest reaching out to their finance department. They can provide helpful information about how much might be deductible versus not. I mean, the range I've seen could be nothing to 30%. So that's not an assumption you want to make kind of across the board for all CCRCs.
Do we want more questions, or do we want to continue with the presentation and save questions till the end?
I think we could do one or two more.
Okay. 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 There's a good one. Are there any current guidelines of what level of income or assets a person needs to enter a typical CCRC in a metro area? And single versus married, is there any difference?
I think there used to be more stringent. You must have kind of X times the monthly fee and income and X times the entry fee and assets. But over time, people's financial situations have evolved. So there's less pensions than there used to be. So people's kind of predictable income is generally less in a lot of cases, but that might mean they have a lot more financial assets. So I don't think they're focusing so much on meeting those stringent requirements. They're factoring in both income and assets when determining if there's sufficient resources to keep up with the fees over time.
And I would add, sort of from a different direction, that there's a very broad range of how shall we say, some CCRCs are designed for the very affluent and others are not. And so I think I wouldn't be comfortable saying that there's a typical fee or a typical level of assets that's required. We can say that fees are higher for couples than for individuals. So couples would need more assets than individuals would.
I think frequently, though, it's not necessarily double the monthly fee. There's some sort of discount for a second person if it's a couple rather than a single person.
Do you want to continue with the presentation?
Let's take one more.
Okay, one more, sure. Okay. Do the CCRC facilities have some sort of financial backing or guarantees to protect the payor in case they go bankrupt?
I think that the short answer is, again, as Laura suggests, it varies. Some CCRCs are part of larger organizations that may be national in scope. Others are single location, and one might expect that the ones that with larger footprints would have perhaps more sophisticated financial analysis supporting their pricing and their service delivery. But as far as a guarantee organization, I'm not aware of one. I'm not aware of anything comparable to the guarantee associations that we see with insurance companies.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the specific community and try and assess if it's a financially strong community. One of the other advisors at Sentinel wrote an article about this that covers a lot more than I think we have time for on the session today. I could put a link to the article in the chat though, if that would be helpful.
Okay, but Laura, we want you to wait to do that because you're starting as we move now.
That's fine. I'll put it in later. I'll put it in later.
Okay, so Carrie, I think we're ready now to move on.
Okay.
And we'll move on and have Laura talk to us about Sally Sample's decision here.
Okay, so Sally informed us that she is considering moving to a CCRC that has a type A contract in the next few years, and she wants help understanding if she can afford to do so. So part of helping Sally assess this, we got a lot of information from the CCRC about what the costs are, what the tax deductibility will be. So in Sally's plan, we're analyzing whether she can afford to a 1-bedroom CCRC apartment. The entry fee is it's $400,000, and 90% of that would be refundable to Sally if she chose to leave, or it would remain there for her estate if she passed away at the community. The monthly service fees for this community are $4,800 per month, and the finance department confirmed that 10% of those are considered to be medical expenses and can be tax deductible. One thing that we're not certain about is exactly how the CCRC fees will evolve over time. So we've asked, again, the finance department a little bit about how their fees have increased in the past. And some years the increases were right in line with inflation, and some years the increases were a little bit higher than inflation. So we're going to think about that when we're thinking about how much or whether Sally can afford to move to this particular community. And in the financial plan model, we also want to account for changes that we anticipate or changes that we think are likely to occur with Sally's out-of-pocket discretionary spending. The reason for this is that the monthly service fees often cover a lot of discretionary or day-to-day living expenses. So many times there are meals included in that monthly service fee. There's entertainment that's put on that's included. There's transportation that might be provided. So when you're evaluating whether a community is affordable for you, you want to consider how your spending might change based on what that specific CCRC community is providing as a part of their fees. And this does vary, again, between each CCRC that you're going to look at. So we've made adjustments to Sally's projected out-of-pocket discretionary spending for when she moves to a CCRC. And the idea is that she's not changing how she's living. She doesn't feel any different. It's just coming from a different place. So her living standard should feel the same, but some of it is being counted in her monthly fee rather than out of pocket directly. Okay. All right, so when we ran Sally's plan, we determined that she could afford to move to this particular type A CCRC. If CCRC fees only increase with inflation over time, we determined that Sally could afford to spend $49,000 on consumption each year. And Sally's told us that she spends $37,000, so that checks out. If we instead included fees that increased above inflation, and in this particular situation, we modeled fees increasing 1.2% above inflation. There's a little bit less margin, so Sally can still afford to move. She'd be able to spend $40,000 on consumption, but there's less flexibility if increases happen beyond that 1.2% above inflation. So faster increases could cause Sally to deplete her resources quicker. All right, so a little bit of a complicated chart here. We're looking at a couple different scenarios. The first one, 70,000, might be familiar. This is the scenario in which Sally stays at home and doesn't require any care. And we said she could afford to spend 70,000, no care is needed, which is affordable for Sally. She can do everything she wants to do and stay at home. If she chooses to move to a CCRC and she doesn't require any care, the CCRC is going to be a lot more expensive than staying at her home. So this is the same number that we looked at on the previous slide for a type A 1-bedroom apartment that increases, the fees increase 1.2% above inflation each year. If we next considered if Sally stayed at home, but she didn't need some care, so she needed 2 hours of help at home each day, starting at age 90. So this is 10 years of this kind of care level. Instead of spending the 70,000 that we talked about in the first scenario, there's a lot less resources available. So Sally can still maintain her living standard, but instead of being able to spend 70,000, she could only spend 48,000. More of that surplus is going towards paying for care. But what's interesting is if you think about with a type A contract, if Sally moved there and needed 10 years of nursing care, there's no difference in terms of how much Sally could afford to spend between having no care requirements or needing substantial care for 10 years. Because as Rick's talked about a lot in the past, with a type A contract, whether you're living independently or whether you need nursing care, that fee stays flat. So there's no kind of extra costs for that additional care. So I think when you're trying to compare older adult living options, it's hard to know ahead of time what is going to be the most affordable option, because it's really going to be dependent on how much care you end up needing. And so I think on this chart, it's showing you that if there's a lot of care that you might need, that's when the type A CCRC could be financially advantageous. A little more detail about those same scenarios on this slide. Those numbers that we looked at previously didn't account for all of Sally's resources in those situations. So in the situations in which Sally stayed at her home, she'd also have home equity that could be accessed if she needed it. And if Sally needed to access her refundable entry fee, that may also be possible at her particular CCRC. If Sally ran through all of her assets and didn't spend her money frivolously, the CCRC said that they'd permit her to use those assets as well. And I think we talked a little bit about surplus in our last webinar. But the surplus represents sort of the difference between how much Sally could afford to spend and what she's currently spending in each of those scenarios. So there's a really large surplus in the scenario in which Sally stays at home and she doesn't need any care. And there's going to be much less surplus in the scenarios in which Sally starts to require care. So less surplus if she stays at home and needs some help at home, and less surplus if she moves to a CCRC. But you want to think about kind of both of those things in combination, the surplus, the financial surplus, as well as what other assets remain that we haven't counted on in the plan. I think one other thing to point out here, that the refundable entry fee is lower than what you might think, because in Sally's case, her entry fee doesn't increase over time. So she's losing purchasing power kind of the longer she stays at the CCRC.
Since CCRCs that offer type A contracts are providing implicit long-term care insurance, you might ask, well, if I have a long-term care insurance policy, can I use it at the CCRC? Do I still need it if I have a type A contract? And the short answer is be careful, and be careful before you commit to the CCRC. CCRCs and long-term care insurance carriers differ. CCRCs differ among themselves, and long-term care insurance carriers differ among themselves on whether and when long-term care insurance purchased from an insurance carrier can be used to fund care at a CCRC, especially with a type A contract, where the monthly fee doesn't change even if you need care. Thus, you might have long-term care insurance and find that you cannot use it to pay for CCRC monthly fees, even if you qualify for benefits based on your health status, by needing help with activities of daily living or having some cognitive impairment. If you think about it, if you have long-term care insurance from an insurance carrier, your benefit may be a significant asset, and it's wise to confirm with the carrier and the CCRC whether you'll be able to use it if you qualify based on your health status. If you move to a CCRC where you can't use your long-term care insurance, you might decide just to drop it. However, you might find that you don't like the CCRC, and in that event, you might regret prematurely canceling your insurance carrier long-term care insurance. So this is a very complex question, and if you have long-term care insurance and you're considering a CCRC, especially one with a type A contract, part of your due diligence should be to talk with your carrier and talk with the CCRC about how the long-term care insurance and the CCRC would cooperate, how they would play together, if you will.
We have some brief points here in terms of how to maybe start your search if you're interested in exploring CCRCs. So one thing you can start with is doing some preliminary research online. We've listed one link there, but there's tons of different search engines that you can use to find information about CCRCs in your area. If you are overwhelmed with the list of options that you find, it might be helpful to speak with a professional that can help you narrow down your options. So elder care experts are examples of people that know a lot about different options in your area. They might know about maybe what communities might appeal to you the most based on your interests. So I think that's a valuable resource to consider using if CCRCs are something you're very focused on. And then we also think it's a very good idea to go and visit your top choices. You might want to visit a couple just to get an idea of how they compare to each other. I will say that during COVID, there's been less visits going on. There's less people allowed to go into these communities for safety reasons. So if you contact one, there may be a delay in scheduling a visit unless you are considering moving to a CCRC in the very near term. All right, and then we just put together a list of some considerations that you might think about when choosing a CCRC out of all the options that might be available. Location's important. Where is it in proximity to family and friends? What are the different housing and apartment options available, and do those meet your requirements? What are the residents like? What is the culture of the community? How's the food? I think that's always a big one, and you might be able to get meals at some of the some of the restaurants and food service options while you go on a visit there. You want to inquire about the different services that are offered at the community, get an idea for what kind of social events and recreational activities are offered there. We list financial health of the community as just one item here, but I think that's a very important one. And I did put the link to an article in the chat. So I'd suggest checking that out because there's a long list of things to think about there. And you also want to review the contract details carefully because everyone is going to be different and you want to make sure you understand kind of everything you're signing up for ahead of time.
Then if we think about affordability, there are several components to think about. The entrance fee has an impact on the cash you'll need and potentially on your estate size. The refundability clarifies how much of the fee is truly deposit-like and how much of it is an upfront fee that in effect covers, it's either in addition to the monthly fee or you could think of it as an implicit long-term care insurance premium, especially with a type A contract. With the monthly fees, you can attempt to compare prices across institutions. That's a complicated thing to do, as Laura suggested, because the institutions vary so much in terms of the amenities that they have, the services that they offer, the quality of the construction and so forth. It's just like buying a house, but it's, as we suggested in a previous webinar, it's much more complicated than buying a house because bundled with the house come the services and amenities that most houses typically don't come with. Are the services that are included services that you want, or are you paying for things that you aren't interested in? Are the excluded services or the services that aren't offered, are there extra fees for those, or are they just not available? The tax deductibility, as Laura suggested, affects your after-tax or your bottom line cost, and can be very important in determining whether the CCRC is affordable for you. How rapid are the fee increases you should plan for? I think Laura would confirm that when we've modeled these situations for clients, the rate of increase makes a huge difference in affordability. And CCRCs that have had more rapid increases, if those increases are sustained, can shift from being quite affordable to just out of range. And finally, what happens if you run out of resources? Is that a risk? I mean, you can tell to a certain extent by looking at your finances and planning out how your expenses might run at the CCRC, if that's a risk that you have to think carefully about. It is true that CCRCs assess your financial situation before qualifying you as a resident, but I think we've had situations where the CCRC says, sure, come on, you have plenty of assets, and we're not convinced. Our opinion differs a little bit. So I think caution is indicated. And as Laura suggested, some CCRCs offer support if you run out of resources, so long as you didn't run out of them frivolously. And I think of somebody taking their resources to the track and betting them all on Bunny Sue or something like that. That would not be, that would count as a frivolous expense, I think. Okay. So that's the prepared material, and I think we're now prepared to take more questions.
Okay, there are more questions. Here's one. How healthy is healthy as an entry requirement? What are the typical standards applied to a yes/no acceptance decision by a CCRC?
I'm smiling because we're going to say it varies again. And I think in part it's going to depend. First of all, it's going to depend on the type of contract that you have. because if you're looking at a rental contract or a type C contract, there's very little risk being assumed by the institution, and so their requirements are going to be less. I think that a way to think about this is fundamentally the CCRC is attempting to forecast whether you are likely to need care and when. And if you're more likely than average to need care, and you're more likely than average to need care earlier, then they're less likely to want to admit you. But it's hard to be precise. I shouldn't say it's hard to be precise. We can't be precise. Go ahead, Laura.
I was just gonna say, I've seen once maybe, and it's a little dated, so it's just not as familiar as some of the other options, but I think there are some communities that may allow a healthy person to enter in sort of a type A situation. And if you are not what they consider healthy, they might still admit you, but you're responsible for full market costs if you end up needing care. But again, this is kind of one place that I've seen. I wouldn't say it's maybe a standard at every CCRC that you're gonna be looking at.
So Laura, that was a couple, was it, with people in different states of health?
I really am not 100% certain.
I see. Okay.
My memory fails me a little bit, but.
Okay. Here's a question. How can I identify a quality CCRC? It sounds almost like a gamble. And is it true that CCRC fees don't escalate with inflation?
There were two questions there.
Yes.
In terms of how to identify, I think that we've provided a number of suggestions there. So let's go back here just a little bit. So in terms of identifying a quality CCRC, first of all, the profession, if you're working with I don't have the right slide, do I? Here. If you're working with a professional, that professional will have views on, especially if the professional is working for you and you're paying them, rather than someone who might be helping you identify a CCRC or an alternative for free. If that's the case, then they may be receiving some kind of payment from the institutions, and then their objectivity might be not quite the same as the objectivity of a professional that you're retaining. But the professionals that you retain, an elder care expert, would be knowledgeable about many of the institutions in the community, and would have placed people in several of them, and would have clients there, and so would know what their experience is. So I think that can be very helpful. And then you can do diligence on the financial status of the various CCRCs. I think it's difficult to do, but if you're comparing several, then you may be able to develop a pretty good idea of which ones are in better financial condition.
Okay. Okay, it's understandable that a CCRC would not want to give more care than is needed, but what about giving less care? Is, that's a danger.
I think that's conceivably a concern. Again, there are reputational issues for the institution to deal with if they're not giving enough care. And I think, and this is not the subject of this discussion or this presentation, but I have some personal experience and some experience with I'm on a I guess it's not a chat, but a group of a list of people who are concerned about retirement and retirement issues, and it's clear to me that it cannot hurt for the resident to have an interested advocate who's not a resident, who's paying attention to their situation and the care they're receiving and so forth. Not that necessarily any of the institutions is out to cut corners or take advantage of the resident, but the resident may not be great at communicating their needs, may not be great at assessing their needs. So it's always good to have another party, a family member, a friend who can, or an elder care professional who can help with the relationship between the resident and the CCRC.
Are CCRCs with type A contracts common within the industry? How does their presence compare with other types of financial arrangements? This person is thinking they may be more common in some geographical areas.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
So that's something that we will attempt to research.
Okay. Another person wanted clarification about what the benevolence fund was.
The benevolence fund is, and not all CCRCs have them, but it's a fund that a CCRC might have to help residents who have exhausted their assets, especially if it's a longtime resident, and that I think they have those funds because it's, first of all, it's benevolent, and it's a I think that a lot of CCRCs have a mission of caring for people, and so they extend that mission by helping people who might have outlived their assets a bit. That's probably the primary motivation.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I don't know. Since CCRCs seem, like a really great solution to a lot of problems, why wouldn't everyone just choose them?
I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, many people want to remain in their own homes and don't want to move. And you can't get to a CCRC without leaving your home and moving. And then CCRCs are not one size fits all. They vary in location, architecture, decoration, amenities, the culture of the people that live there. And some people may not be able to find a CCRC that appeals to them or a CCRC that they can afford. So while it can be a great solution, it is by no means the best solution for everyone.
Right. The people have asked about the elder care information, and Laura has placed the link to elder care information in the chat. She has also placed a link to an article about finding out about the financial stability of CCRCs in the link as well. Just so you know, because I know I'm getting that question a couple times. There's a person that asked the question, are there resources if for a lower income person to enter a CCRC?
I am not familiar with any. That's, again, I think something that we can research a little bit and see if we can find about. And Carrie, I think we should take perhaps one more question.
Okay. Oh, okay. This is a rough one. How common is it for a CCRC to evict a resident who exhausts their financial resources?
I have no data.
Yeah.
I have no data. And I don't know, I mean, we can look, I don't know that we're going to be able to find that, I'm afraid. I don't know of a central reporting system that would capture that information. Okay, well, sorry that we can't answer all your questions. But let's move to a summary and summarize what we do think we know. And I'm going to apologize in advance here for multiple acronyms. CCRC stands for Continuing Care Retirement Community, and LTC lowercase I stands for Long-Term Care Insurance. So let's work through the summary here. So continuing care retirement communities integrate multiple living options and facilitate moving from one to another. The Type C contract especially implicitly offers long-term care insurance.
Type A.
Type A, sorry. Traditional long-term care insurance may not coordinate well with the CCRC, and especially if you're seeking the implicit long-term care insurance offered by a Type A contract, early entry reduces the risk that a disqualifying condition will emerge. So if you're thinking about moving to a CCRC with a Type A contract, waiting to apply risks that you may not be able to get in if some illness or disability emerges. So it may be something that you might not, if you're convinced that you want to do it, you might not want to wait. There is solvency risk associated with CCRCs offering Type A contracts, but it's very difficult to assess. And again, the article that Laura put in the chat suggests some ways to get started thinking about it. And finally, high rates of fee increase are going to make the economics less favorable. So it's to the extent that you can find a CCRC that has had better experience with keeping their fees steadier, that's going to make them, I think, a more attractive option. Okay, so that concludes the webinar, and it also concludes our series on older adult living. And just to recap, we spoke about housing issues for older adults. We spoke about long-term care and long-term care insurance, housing options, and then today about CCRCs. All of these webinars, or the first 3 webinars, are available on our website at the webinars link, and today's will be available there shortly. Looking ahead, we have 2 webinars coming up on bonds. In May, I'll be talking about my bonds are down. I thought bonds were safe investments. And in June, I'll be talking about TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. You can register for upcoming webinars. There's a link in our April newsletter, which will be coming out later this month. And if you don't receive the newsletter, you can sign up for it at our website, sensiblefinancial.com. And you can sign up for the webinars at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. Thank you very much. Here is our contact information. We are so glad you took time from your day to attend, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.